Hey there, good evening. I'm here with Loyal and Scott, and I'm excited because we get to talk a little bit more science tonight. A couple weeks ago, for those of you that were in service, in our Doubting God series we've been going through, we talked about, what do you do with God and science? In so many ways, it can feel like you got to believe in one or the other. But if God is really who we believe he is, then he created the earth. He created science. He created the way everything works together and fits together. And tonight we're just going to have a dialogue and bring to you a bit more information that I wasn't able to give on Sunday morning. Some scientific evidences that point to a creator and some scientific evidences that point to a young earth. That really gets me curious to dig into that kind of stuff. And so we're just going to dive in, and we're glad that you are tuning into our conversation. If anything we say piques your curiosity, reply to this in the comments, and we may have an opportunity to address or answer any questions you might have in a future recording. So thanks again for checking this out, and let's dive in. So, Scott, thanks for being here.
Always.
Yeah, and I want you to just kind of kick us off with an intro to this idea of God and science and how it all fits together.
Okay. Well, I wanted to start off by maybe interesting the crowd a little bit, but I do believe in the Big Bang.
Okay.
But I know who banged it.
Okay. All right.
So,
okay.
What does the scripture say in Genesis 1? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Skeptics will say, well, I don't believe in the creation world. I believe in either it just being eternal, which we'll talk about later, and also that they believe maybe it was just the world came from nothing. And we'll talk about that term, nothing. When we talk about the Big Bang and the initiation of the world, most scientists believe what you mentioned two Sundays ago, that most scientists believe now that the world did at some point begin to exist. Now, what started to begin to exist in that time? Time, space, and matter. So whatever initiated this initial surge, which is called the Big Bang by scientists, that initial surge had to be outside of time, space, and matter. So it has to be timeless, spatial, and non-material. Now, we can use that as Christians to point to God. We believe God is non-material, that he's the spirit, he is timeless, he's outside of time, he did not have a beginning, nor does he have an end, and that he is non-material. So he's a spirit, like I said before, and then he's spaceless. I know I said that a couple of times, but so when God created it, there's no way that we can know exactly how he did it, but science can point us to maybe some evidential claims or evidence that shows maybe this is how God did it. And I believe some evidence of the Big Bang, some claims of it, is how God did it.
Okay, that's interesting. I know that there are a variety of theories that Christians hold to. I know that there are some Christians that believe in evolution. They believe that God caused evolution to happen. Other people believe that you should take the Bible literally as it's written in Genesis chapter 1, and that God made everything with just speaking it into existence, and it occurred, in a 24-hour day period. I lean that way. I've studied the variety of theories, and from some of the papers I've read that you've written, you've talked about day-age theories, gap theories, and I personally lean towards closer to almost a literal 24-hour period. And mainly, the main reason that I lean that way is because of sin. And that may sound confusing, but what I mean by that is, what caused death to enter our world?
The choice of Adam and Eve's sin.
So if one believes in a day age theory or a day era theory that one day equals a period of time. The Bible says a day is like 1,000 years to God. If we take that literally, then on day one, whether it was 1,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years, and day two, another 1,000 or another 1,000,000,000 years, by the time you have creatures being created, and then eventually on the sixth day you have human beings, if you believe in this day age theory, how do things die if no one sinned yet? If you buy into the scriptural truth that death is a result of sin, then you might have been able to have these eras of time pass, but in my view, you couldn't have death yet. And so by the time man is created on the sixth day, when God created Adam and Eve, you might have had certain things living on the earth already for a while, if it isn't a literal 24-hour day. So I can buy into that. Some who hold that theory believe that there was enough time that the dinosaurs died before Adam and Eve were created. And that's where I struggle. And I know that fossil evidence, and we don't have time to just linger on this one issue, but I've seen some really cool fossil evidence showing that mankind and prehistoric creatures, dinosaurs, coexisting. And I know some attribute that towards early forms of man, like Neanderthal man.
Yeah.
Or I'm not up to date on all the kinds of men, the Peking man and the Nebraska man, but I don't believe in evolution. I believe that God created everything as we see it, and I believe He created a mature earth, like I taught that morning.
I believe that too.
Yeah.
Because it only makes sense if we look at Adam and Eve. They weren't created as children. They were created maybe like a 32-year-old. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Boyle?
I don't have a position. Not officially. Here's the thing. I don't know if a position. I don't know if evolution or six-day creationism or any of these theories will end up destroying any other part of my theology. I think whichever one I choose, it all works. As long as I hold to a literal Adam and Eve, and from them all humanity came. I think that's pretty important. I think Paul emphasizes that a lot. Well, he mentions that.
Romans, yeah.
Yeah, in Romans. And so I think as long as I hold that, I don't know if I mean, I can lean one way or the other, but I have no idea.
Yeah.
So I enjoy this conversation. I think one thing that's interesting, since you brought up death, I think a key verse here, or an important verse here, would be Romans 5:12, because we could cite Genesis 1, and we can say that Adam, that because of this, Adam died and Eve died and all humanity died. But I think that doesn't necessitate on its own that animals aren't dying as well. But I think it could be, but it's not a requirement. And so I think a stronger verse for that might be Romans 5:12, when it says, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." When it says that sin entered, that death came through sin, I think you have to try to weigh out, is this death just for humanity, or is this just a blanket statement, death for all? I think the way you weigh that can help answer whether or not there was death before the fall. But I don't know. I think that it's a hard argument. It's a rare argument to make that death didn't exist from before the fall, at least from what I've heard.
Yeah, that's interesting. Another way I've heard it put, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with Creation Research Institute and Answers in Genesis. Both, I've think that they hold pretty good amount of information. This idea of death coming strictly as a result of mankind's sin. It wasn't just death that came, but all of the universe, all of creation was cursed as a result of sin. But before that, there was no death. And so that's where I struggled with the idea that dinosaurs weren't. I think whether or not he called him a Tyrannosaurus Rex, it says that Adam named all the animals.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in some unique way that happened. I can't wait to be in heaven one day and to have God say, hey, you guys had all these theories and I laughed at them. I wonder if God ever laughs at us. But I can't wait to one day be made fully aware of how he did make it happen. I'm excited about that.
It's just a fun. Oh, sorry. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Another fun point behind that is the word that the Adam is human. That's the word means human.
Mm-hmm.
And what's also funny is that the word for earth is Adamah. So there's Adam and there's Adamah. They're basically the word human means earthling.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
There's a deep connection between humanity and earth, which makes sense why that the earth was cursed because of Adam's sin. And there is some sort of deep causal connection between the two. So how far that goes is an interesting thing to play out.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's cool. Yeah. All right. So whether or not we believe that the earth was literally created in a week or over a period of time, we're all in agreement that even science now, about 100 years ago, science came up with the idea that, hey, the earth had a beginning. And there are some evidences that you can share with us, Scott, right, that point to there was a beginning. The Bible, as Christians, the Bible says, in the beginning, God created. And there's scientific evidence that point to, because for years, even, what was the real smart guy with the big hair? Albert Einstein. He believed that the universe was eternal.
Yeah.
And he even changed some of his beliefs based on the French guy who came up with the theory that and discovered that there was a beginning. Mm-hmm. Tell us what you have there, Scott.
So that name of that scientist, I cannot remember his name, but
we'll put it in the show notes when we
he
find
did
it.
come up with this idea, and I'll talk about it here in a little bit more depth. But he determined this idea like maybe the world didn't always was eternal. At some point, it did have a beginning because of all this different scientist evidence that he's seen. So one thing that he theorized that he did not actually confirm yet was a redshift. So that initial surge that caused the universe to expand is actually still expanding. So that's evidence that the world did at some point come from a beginning and expand out. Now, when you look through a telescope, which is called the Doppler effect, if you see something shifting or a far-off object, it's going to appear red to you. Now, he had that idea maybe that the world is still expanding because of that initial surge, like I was talking about. And Einstein, like you're saying, did not want that to be the case. He did not want the world to have a beginning because he knew that would open the door for what he called the religious factor. So what was one of his main theories that he had is called general relativity. Now, in that general relativity, he did the math, and he determined because of that the world did at some point have a beginning. So what he did was he inserted a zero. It's called a fudge factor, and it's actually a credit to him as his greatest blunder because it was so obvious that his math was wrong, and somebody came along later and said, "Hey, Einstein, your math is wrong." The world did have a beginning, and now Hubble later came on and built his telescope. You want to guess what it was called?
The Hubble telescope.
The Hubble telescope. So what he did was he looked through the telescope and looked at the distant stars, and he actually seen this red shift, and he confirmed what that earlier scientists theorized, and that Einstein failed to prove that, or not necessarily failed to prove, but he was not able to prove it because he didn't want it to be a thing. And he actually invited Albert Einstein to come to his place where he had the telescope and said, "Look through this telescope and tell me what you see." And Einstein said, "Yeah, I see a red shift," confirming that there is at some point that expanding of the universe.
Now, to clarify, are you saying that Einstein developed his theory of relativity as a way to go against theistic positions? Like he was trying to actively go against it?
Well, no, not necessarily. So what the general relativity is talking about is the force of gravity, right? Talking all about gravity. Now, when he was doing his math and he was coming up with that, or theorizing and doing out his math for this theorize, he saw, because of what he was discovering in that theories of the force of gravity, that the universe did at some point have a beginning. And he necessarily didn't like that because, like I said, he actually is quoted, well, if this is true, this opens the door for the religion.
Okay.
Versus, because all scientists before that said that the world was eternal.
So you're
closing the door for God to create the world.
okay.
I also know that based on some of that information, they saw that the universe was expanding.
Yes, still expanding today.
There was not just a beginning in time, but there was a beginning spot in space, physically, and things are expanding outward.
At one point, there was a theory it seemed pretty popular as far as I can understand. I was a kid, so I don't really know. But it was the idea that the universe is infinitely expanding and collapsing. But then I heard that we found out that the universe is not only expanding, but its rate of expansion is increasing. Like it's going faster and faster, meaning that it will never collapse again from its current spot.
Wow.
That also disproves that the world or the universe is eternal, because what's the definition of eternal? Had no beginning, has no end. So if we're coming up with all these scientific ways or to prove that maybe the world will end one day, the world's not eternal.
That an Earth couldn't exist eternally. I know the Greeks at one point believed that there was it like at the time of Jesus wasn't that a theory that I think Socrates was that the operating mode is that the world is just this eternal matter that just never changed and was always existing, something like that. I think they believe that, but that we now know that can't be true because the universe is expanding and it came from a singular point. So I mean, but that's just the kind of operation they had. It's like, it's just this eternal world that will always be, always will ever be, and will never substantially change. I don't think they even had the idea of global warming. So.
Yeah. So I mean, the Bible says in the beginning God created. Science now even says, I think all leading scientists agree that there was a beginning. Now, what caused the beginning is up for debate and theorizing. I'll take the opportunity now to throw this out. Science isn't just based on the scientific method, because we can't observe and repeat the Big Bang, right? There's no way of knowing for sure. So even science is based on faith.
That's basically what theorizing is, yeah.
Well, an argument that I've heard people make is that, well, that is because it is outside of the realm of scientific inquiry. This whole idea of what happened before space and time and matter, and maybe even logic. They say, well, that's not something that we can even inquire into. It is not good to ever have a position on it. It is not a right thing to do. If you hold a position on it, you're not being authentic. You're not being scientific or just logically coherent, because there is no logic outside of that. There's nothing you can hold. Is what I've heard, which is it's for some people that's just straight up scientism. The scientific it assumes materialism. It assumes that world is all that exists, or it's all it's worth considering, which is it's quite fallacious on its own merits. It assumes that there's nothing that can or would enter into that universe and interact with it. It assumes that things like miracles couldn't exist, just because it's something that's beyond our capability of understanding and knowing. Therefore, we should not ever hold a position that it could exist. Things like that.
Yeah. It sounds like a bunch of beliefs to me. Yeah. No, I get it. Yeah. But along those lines, there is a good amount of science that lines up with what the Bible says. Again, In the beginning, God created. Science about 100 years ago said, okay, it looks like there was a beginning. But there are other things that are evidences of, the earth possibly being a young earth.
So let me go back to real quick to
Yeah.
a argument that is going to lead into more conversations. It's called the Kalam cosmological argument. It's really theorized and really pushed by William Lane Craig. He's a theologian / apologist, really wise guy. So the premise one says that everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise two, the world began to exist, like we've been talking about. We've shown evidence and we've shown reasons that we can believe that the world and universe did have a beginning. Therefore, premise three, therefore the world has a cause. Now, what caused that universe? Now, we can talk about, did God cause that universe or did nothing cause that universe? A lot of scientists like Lauren Krauss would say, no, he's a very high atheist. He does not believe in God. He has a book called The Universe from Nothing, if I'm saying that title correctly. Now, that word nothing, it's funny in his book. If you read his book, he changes the word nothing to something. So what was before the creation of the universe? Lauren Krauss and some scientists would say, well, there were some particles and there were some atoms that came across and smashed into each other, therefore creating that initial surge. Well, I can ask the question, what created those particles? What created those atoms? What came before that? Now, the problem also with that is, if we ask that question, what can atheists and non-believing people ask? Who or what created God?
Okay.
Now, we believe in an eternal God, that God had no beginning and will have no end. So when they say, oh, well, who created God? And then they can continue to repeat, well, who created that God? Who created that God? Who created that God? Well, if you keep asking that question, where are you going to end up at? At a beginning. Mm-hmm. You have to have a beginning to continuously create. Now, the thing about God is he's out of space, time, and matter. He had no beginning, therefore he has no cause. Though the premise states that anything that begins to exist has a cause. Not everything that exists has a cause. So like I said, we know or we believe that God had no beginning, so therefore he has no cause. He is outside of that space, time, and matter. Therefore he is the creator of all things. Now, how do we wrap that in our minds that he's always been eternal, he has no beginning and no end? It's something that we're just going to put on faith.
Now, I want to go into that just a little deeper. Why would it be a bad idea? Because I think it seems like a bad idea, but why would it be a bad idea for you to have an eternal regression of things causing things back into eternity? I know some people have actually argued that they say that because if you can believe in an eternal God, well, I can believe in eternal cause back into infinity, and that there is no original origin. It's an infinity of causes. You can believe in an infinite being. I can believe in that too.
So if you incorporate the laws of science, you can't necessarily hold that theory. Now some people, or I would say some religious faiths, believe that there were multiple gods, that God created a God, and then that person became a God. It's Mormonism. Mormons believe that we all will, or at least if you live a Mormon life, you're going to lead into to becoming a God one day. And if you want to talk more about that, you can.
We'll save that for another episode.
Okay. So, but that ties into somewhat what you believe is, or what you said, not believe, I'm sorry, that we could have that understanding or that belief, but we as Christians don't hold that. So now as the universe, a multiple amount of days than before, it's not possible because we know the law of science. And now that goes into what you wanted to talk about is a young earth. The second, or Newton's laws, a second law of thermodynamics. Do we know what that states?
Is that the one where all energy is decreasing or breaking down or something?
Anything that, or any matter of energy will soon run out. So if the universe has been eternal or is even billions of years old, that amount of energy that we see in the world probably would have run out by now. It's kind of like I'll give you an analogy. If you put an ice cream cone on this table and you walk out and you come back maybe 10 minutes later, you know the ice cream cone is going to be halfway melted or it's going to be fully melted. Because of the second law of thermodynamics states that amount of energy in that ice cream cone is going to run out and it's going to melt. And the same thing applies to our world, onto our earth. We can look at certain things that within the earth that the energy, like say the atmosphere. The earth's atmosphere has been stronger in the past. We believe that it was really strong in the initial creation, and that some people theorize that when God sent the flood, that the atmosphere had a layer of water around it, and that water came crashing down onto the planet, and which helped flood the earth. Now, since that vapor of water left the Earth's atmosphere, it caused the Earth to age a lot quicker, or that the atmosphere to decrease over time. Now, if the Earth was 1 billion years old, that atmosphere would have run out by now. That's just one theorization that we can talk about.
Yeah, like the flood waters. Well, in Genesis, what's interesting about the waters that came with the flood in Genesis 6 is if you look at Genesis chapter 1, one thing that caught my attention while in college doing a creation evolution course was I never read Genesis 1:1 with the understanding it said that God parted the waters below the firmament and above the firmament. And the firmament was the sky. So I had always read that and thought, firmament, oh, that's the ground. He parted waters and the ground. But here he's talking about waters above the earth. And a lot of creation scientists believe the waters above the earth created a greenhouse effect around the earth for all those years, allowing the most perfect environment for growth. I mean, greenhouses are used to grow plants and fruits and vegetables year-round. Imagine the whole earth, a greenhouse type of environment. You know, what causes aging is UV light. And when the flood happened, many creation scientists believe that water around the canopy around the earth collapsed to the earth, flooding the earth. And also, many believe that's when Pangea broke apart, forming the continents we know now, because it talks about the waters above and the waters from below bursting forth, and the crust of the earth splitting. All of that happening with a cataclysmic event, which is, I believe, when we have the extinction of dinosaurs, when we have other life on earth was cut short after that point forward. Genesis chapter 6 or 7, it says, from now man's days will only be, or years will only be 120 years. Before that, you see man living 500, 600, 700, and over 1,000 years. And there are certain creatures on the earth that the longer they live, the bigger they get. They never stop growing. And that's why I think we have fossil records showing these gigantic beasts that were allowed to live under that protective canopy that God created, this perfect paradise that once was, and creatures, along with mankind, was able to live and flourish until the great flood in Genesis 6. So, yeah.
I mean,
go
ahead.
When I read, or when I pull up Wikipedia, and I just pull up Pangea, and they'll say things like that the breakup was 175. Oh, I'm gonna make a fool of myself. MA, I imagine MA is a million years ago. Is that what MA is?
I have no idea.
MA is it's a long time.
Right.
10,000 years of early creations. So, do we know how they got that number? And do six-day creation theorists or people who hold that, would they disagree with scientific contentions on that?
You know, I don't know the answer to the first question of how we got that number. I know that there's all kinds of processes scientifically for dating, carbon dating, and looking at is it called strata? Is it the layers of the ground?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so there's a number of ways that they can look at, is it tectonic shifts? There's all kinds of things that they can measure over time. But there are certain things can happen, not necessarily over eons and eons, but suddenly. Like there's a museum that has a fossil of a prehistoric fish fossilized in the act of getting ready to capture another fish. So does that speak of, this thing died and somehow another fish died right in front of it? It just looks like, I see it more like, okay, the flood happened, the waters crashed, you have this bursting of molten rock and lava, and a fish getting ready to eat another one is all of a sudden encased in the act of biting another fish and frozen in time for us to see today. I think we see, some call it a meteorite hit, an asteroid hitting the earth. I believe that cataclysmic event that we see scientific evidence of is the flood, and God causing the earth to split and the crust to open and things to move, immediately causing the changing of the world. The reason why you can find seashells like in the middle of deserts, everything changed in with that event. That's how I've heard it taught for those who believe in creation and science together.
Well, the age of the universe is the electromagnetic field around the Earth, right, coming from the northern and southern poles that help protect the Earth from radiation from the sun. Now we can tell that are decreasing over time. It's very little, and we see little evidence over the couple hundred years that we've been actually viewing it scientifically. Now again, if the Earth was 1 billion years old, according to the second law of thermodynamics, that magnetic field will probably either ran out by now, it would have been so weak that the sun radiation that was coming and hitting the Earth on a daily basis would have killed us all by now. But we're not dead yet. So. Number 2 is, I've heard it theorized, and scientists are actually seeing that the moon is shifting away from the Earth ever so slightly. Now, if the moon is shifting away from the Earth, from the gravitational pull of the Earth constantly, if it's 1 billion years old, scientists would have determined by now, if it was 1 billion years old, that the moon would have launched out of Earth's atmosphere or gravitational pull.
Yeah.
And just think about what that kind of would cause to the Earth.
Yeah, that would be. There's all kinds of things: tidal waves, tidal shifts, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. I've also heard that there's chemicals in our atmosphere that can be measured. One of them, helium. And there's a really cool, I wondered where helium came from, because we go and buy it to fill balloons, things like that. But helium is not a renewable source. Is that the right term?
Energy, something like that.
It's, once we use it up, it's gone.
Yeah.
And it's constantly escaping into the universe, and they're able to mine it from the depths of the Earth. There's a really cool National Geographic special. I Googled, where did we get helium? And it isn't just Robert's oxygen down in Manassas. It actually comes from a place in the ground. And there's a study that shows that the Earth is only tens of thousands of years old based on the amount of helium in our atmosphere, which is definitely different than eons and eons or billions and billions. And there are other chemicals that we find, like in diamonds. There is, I looked it up, there's radiocarbon in diamonds, and scientists have done studies on diamonds, and the amount of measurable radiocarbon in diamonds points to the Earth being a max of 55,000 years, which is a far cry from billions. And so, I believe that God made a mature Earth, that at the moment that God created the Earth, Adam could have dug and pulled up a diamond.
And proposed to Eve.
And proposed to Eve, exactly. It didn't take eons and eons for that diamond to form. God made an Earth with the appearance of age. If he would have chopped down a tree to build a log cabin, he could have counted the rings that made the tree look like it was, 100 years old, but God just created it. Mm-hmm. So I lean towards a mature Earth theory, a young Earth theory. It may not be, 6,000 or 15,000. Maybe there is some type of era, but again, I think it's younger than what many evolutionists prescribe.
So that would be both. So it's got elements of both it's got some elements of being young Earth because it's got things like helium in it, is what you're saying. Mm-hmm. But it's also got elements that make it appear very old.
Yeah.
That sounds confusing a little bit.
Sure.
It definitely explains all the variables. So that's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, Loyal. I like that. Yeah.
I mean, I guess, do scientists today have anything? Do you know how they try to address these odd variables like helium and carbon dating of diamonds?
I would love to find out. I haven't heard recently. I would have to do research to know.
I have no idea.
I don't know yet, but it's definitely a good question to ask.
I really like the whole old universe, young Earth theory, and so I really like your position. So what I'm saying there's not a critique at all.
Yeah. No, I get it. I get what you're saying.
In 1964, Arno Penzias, if I'm saying that correctly, and Robert Wilson stumbled upon while they were working on a large horn antenna at Bell Telephone Laboratories in New Jersey. So I have pictures of it, and we'll insert it into this podcast. But you'll see this big antenna, like a radio antenna that they're talking about, and they were working on it. Now, when they were listening to it, they heard a lot of this background like radiation sound, like you hear shh. If you're on a wrong channel for a radio and you're trying to tune it to the right channel, mm-hmm. You hear that same sound. That's what they were hearing, and they had other people come in, like workers on the antenna, I guess, and go, just clean it. You got a lot of bird poop on there. Go in there, clean it, and try again. So they did. They went in there and they cleaned all the bird poop off, and they came back, and that sound was still there. Well, now what they discovered was that is actually the radiation from the initial surge of the Big Bang. It's kind of like you throw a flashbang. So I'm like when you throw a flashbang into a room and it goes off, and you go in there and you take out the enemy or you stop the hostile person in that room, you're still going to hear that kind of that essence of that bang. And,
like the ringing in your ear type of thing?
Hear that. You enter that room and you're going to hear that ringing in your ear. So the radiation that they were hearing in their telescope, their antenna, was the initial bang of that initial surge. So they were discovering on accident the essence of that initial surge.
How big is this antenna?
I really don't know the size, but if you look at the picture, it's pretty good size. Like they're standing in front of it, and it's like it's pretty big behind them.
Wow. Okay.
So that just shows that again there was an initial surge, and now they did further research. They sent a COBE, which is the Cosmic Background Explorer, out into space, and they confirmed it. There is that radiation now. That cosmic background radiation that was a part of the initial surge. Now that that background radiation is starting to dwindle,
dissipate.
So the amount that they're listening to or they're hearing is starting to go away. So just think about this too. When they discovered it, it was the perfect moment in time for them to discover it. Kind of like it was ordained to be discovered.
Yeah.
So
that's good.
And then now I'll find out the name for it, but there was a scientist that once he read all the background information or the information from what these satellites were picking up, he's saying he quoted, "This is us discovering what the book of Genesis states, that God created the world." So that part of that radiation led not only the Arnold and Robert to believing that God created the world, but also another skeptic like the guy that made that quote and researched all these studies. Goes, yeah, what the book of Genesis is saying in the Bible is true, that God created the world.
That's wild. Yeah, I've heard, so there are, I forget the name, I quoted him, that he said that the greatest argument for God was the precise fine-tuning of the universe.
Yes.
That everything works just perfectly for life to exist. And although he does not believe in God, he said that the greatest evidence that there might be an intelligent creator behind everything is just how fine-tuned everything is. The position of the sun and the earth, the acts, the tilt of the earth, the way certain chemicals interact together. It just all is perfect. It's on an edge, like just slightly one way or another with several things, and life wouldn't exist. And there are a number of scientists and evolutionists who scratch their head at that level of complexity and fine-tuning. Like if I were to throw, a bomb into the woods and it would go off, we would think we'd go out there and we'd find shattered trees and shrapnel of things that were broken. We'd be shocked if all of a sudden everything fell into place and formed a log cabin from that explosion. But that's often what the Big Bang theorists believe, is that there was this explosion and everything just happened to fall into place to make life possible. And I lean towards intelligent design and the evidence of a creator.
Yeah.
Well, I think what's really fascinating about that, I think our numbers might differ on this a little bit, but I heard one guy say that it was the likelihood of all of the astronomical things aligning for the sake of just having a habitable universe, or not even habitable Earth, habitable universe, one of those two, is 10 to the power of 100.
Yeah.
And what's fascinating about that number, so I like math, numbers are fun.
Really?
And I forgot, I'm forgetting details, but there's the probability of doing something 1 against 10 to the power of 100 it's an astronomically large number. So much so, if you filled the entire observable universe with grains of sand, and then you did that several times, and then just happened to choose the right grain of sand in the entire universe or observable universe, that's the kind of the probability we're dealing with here. Wow. It's so astronomically small, it's not even worth considering. I mean, technically, yes. On paper, yes, it's possible, but it's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. I remember Richard Dawkins, he said the God delusion, was that him?
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to know what his response was, and he says in his book, he says, well, yeah, that's a really big number, but you got to remember, it's just like rolling a 10-sided die 100 times and getting a 10, or getting a 0 100 times in a row. And so it's approachable, something that could happen, but that doesn't make sense of probability. Like, that's not how probability works. I mean, yes, it's the same probability of rolling 100 zeros? Yeah, 100 zeros in a row of rolling a 10-sided die. That's 10 to the power of 100. But the probability of that happening is still so astronomically small. I don't think we understand just how unlikely that is. I mean, it just doesn't happen. Like to get 100 of those in a row. Mm-hmm. It seems like it's approachable, but as soon as you try to roll a die the second time, if you get a 0 one time, well, congratulations, you got it once. Mm-hmm. If you try to roll a 0 the second time, it's just a 100 chance already. You got to do 100 times in order to get 2 zeros. Mm-hmm. And then if you want to do it 3 times, you're probably surpassing Yahtzee odds at that point.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just and especially not only to have these incredible odds, but to get it on your first try. I think that's what's really important here. Is the first run. They say, well, if we have enough runs of it, we'll eventually get it. But no, this is the first. We're assuming run one. Yes, because that's how probability works. It means you have one chance. In one chance, you get this to happen. Not you have infinity chances. So, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, I love that we're talking about this because this is the last point I wanted to touch on is the fine-tuning of the universe. And like you're saying, Richard Higgins said that this, for their side, like Richard Higgins and Charles Darwin, all those people, is the fine-tuning of the universe is their stumbling block for their argument. So if the fine-tuning universe is true, then they really have no leg to stand on.
The existence of our entire universe and everything in it comes down to about 30 numbers. Physicists call these the physical constants. Now these numbers, as I understand them, are fixed values of a fundamental physical condition we find in our universe. For example, the force of gravity or the expansion rate of the universe, right down to the subatomic, such as the mass of a proton or electromagnetic force. Now here's the amazing part. Each one of these numbers are so perfectly precise and so balanced with one another that if any one of them were off, plus or minus the slimmest fraction, in some cases literally this much, there would be no life and no universe as we know it. For example, if the gravitational constant were just a hair bigger or smaller, the stars of the early universe would be too hot or too cool to produce any life-essential elements. If the electromagnetic force were just a hair stronger or weaker, atoms couldn't form into molecules, and the entire universe would be a giant cloud of subatomic particles. If the mass of a tiny little proton was just a tiny bit bigger, there'd be no hydrogen, which means no hydrogen stars, which means no carbon and oxygen made in those stars, which basically means no water and no biology. So it appears, to most physicists, not to all, that since the very beginning, the entire universe has been perfectly tuned for one thing. Now, physicists admit they have no idea how these numbers came to be so perfectly, and they all agree it would be unreasonable to think that it all just happened by chance. So according to, there are only two possible explanations. Either these numbers were set by a super intellect, or they occurred naturally in one universe amidst trillions upon trillions upon trillions upon trillions of other universes that we could never possibly know exist.
One of my studies, I think I read that it was just, there's like 150.
One way that they theorize or they come up to not talk about God, because, the scripture says that some people's hearts and eyes are blinded to the truth, and that's by their choice. Because they don't want to see God, they don't want to know God is real, they just don't want to admit it. One thing that they came up with for this fine-tuning argument is the multiverse theory. Now, I'm not talking about DC or Marvel. I'm talking about an actual theory.
Superhero stuff, yeah.
They believe that there's a machine out in the universe that is spitting out all these universes, hundreds of them, thousands of them. And they believe at some point, obviously, right, that this machine is going to spit out a universe, our universe, that is finely tuned. It is at the exact measure, at the exact a number of all these things that needs to be a thing for our life or our universe to exist and have life.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting about that argument is, first off, you could ask who made the machine. You can just go,
Yeah,
Ooh,
yeah, exactly.
Again, we're back to the point of what created.
But even if we accept that, even if we go with that, what I think is particularly interesting is that the world that can sustain life that we have is surprisingly good. You could have had a different world to sustain life that we are in, that was not near, that most likely, I think the odds are, is that the life that was sustained life that have us having this conversation wouldn't be nearly as good as this one. Like, sunsets are beautiful. I love watching sunsets. I love being in the forest. These things are objectively beautiful things. Why would we be in a universe where these things are objectively beautiful? It doesn't, I don't know. I think there's a lot of odd things in this world that are just strangely good, that even if we happen to be in a habitable universe, it's unlikely that we'd be in one like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
that's a good
I
point.
don't know if the infinite generation theory is particularly persuasive on a probability standpoint. I mean, I don't know. Go back to probability. You shuffle a deck of cards. That deck of cards, it's 52 cards, and we think this is just small numbers. These are huge numbers. If you shuffle a deck of 52 cards and you make it thoroughly random, it is more likely that no deck of cards has ever existed in that shuffled order ever in existence, and never will be again, because it's just probability explodes like crazy. It's like compound interest times everything.
You get really passionate about numbers.
I taught pre-calculus. I really enjoy numbers.
That's
I want people to
good.
take probability seriously.
I think in closing arguments here, I think we're wrapping up here, is everything that we've mentioned here today and all this stuff may point to that a God or intelligent designer created the universe. But it doesn't mean that the Christian God created the universe. We have to determine that off of other things, right? Which other podcasts we'll be talking about. But if we can at least get to the point that convincing people that a God created the universe, then we can open the doors for this book, everything that's in this book, especially a personal loving God that would send his son to die on the cross for our sins, is possible. And it's really reasonable to conclude that that is the case. Because I don't think you can argue from the Quran or the Book of Mormons, or I would say Judaism, but Judaism and Christianity is kind of like brothers and sisters. We believe in the same thing. We just veer off at the point of Jesus. But again, if we can get to the idea or the convincing argument that God created the universe and it wasn't by mere chance or like an accident, and it was because for a reason, maybe that reason is for you, the listeners, to be sitting here to know Jesus Christ.
That's good. Good closing thoughts. Any closing thoughts from you, Loyal?
We set a really high bar for proof. We should have a really high bar for proof. When I think of saying, I proved the God existence, I think our bars are just so high. Like, what does it mean to prove something? If we go back to really what the word prove means, I can't prove that this table exists. I can't prove that you all exist. I could be in a simulation for all I know. Like, that is a legitimate possibility.
It is actually a theory.
Yeah, and so when we try to say, like, oh, I've proved beyond a shadow of doubt that God exists, well, no, it's all probabilities. That's what it's all what is most reasonable to believe. And I don't know, I think I look at all these things, all the different variables that point towards God's existence, and I think, well, this is actually a really reasonable thing to believe. And in fact, I think I would argue or suggest with all the things that we can look at, it's just about as reasonable as believing this chair exists. I know that's a strong statement, but I really do think we can hold to it.
Yeah. Well, these are good thoughts, and our hope is to inspire you to dig deeper into exploring the evidences that are out there. There's a ton of research that you can do. I pulled up some information from Answers in Genesis is a great site, the Creation Research Institute, and we'll also have others list in the show notes connected to this this recording.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us. There's a lot more we could have said, but we've been at it for an hour. We're going to bring this to a close at this point. But our hope above all is that you come to know the God who created you, who loves you, who sent his son to die for you so that he could have a relationship with you and experience life with you forever. So our hope is that you come to know Jesus as your Savior. We'll see you next time. Have a good one.
Please like and share this video.
Ring that bell.